Hi everybody, welcome to the first lecture of Chapter 3. We're going to finish up Chapter 2, and we're going to start by expanding on the idea of qualitative and quantitative research, which I started talking about in the first lecture. So I used the metaphor of the left brain and right brain to talk about quantitative and qualitative, the idea being that quantitative research is usually what we tend to think of when you have a hypothesis that you test that kind of follows the scientific method, follows deductive reasoning, where you have a theory, then you come up with a specific hypothesis that you test it. So quantitative analysis tends to be deductive. It tends to involve numbers that use statistics. You tend to end up with correlations like we looked at in the spurious correlations, where you end up with like the R value, where you look at how tightly two variables are correlated. Quantitative analysis tends to be very controlled. Like when you do a study, when you're looking at the effects of exercise on depression, you're trying to control for all the other variables that might be affecting depression, like social class and diet and other things, medication people are taking, so that you can just look at the specific impact of exercise. Quantitative analysis tends to be rigid, and I don't mean rigid in a bad way. I mean rigid in the sense that it's organized and tightly run. It's logical, so let's look at this as it relates to that. It tends to be much more simple, right? Because if you're looking at one variable, exercise on depression, and we know that depression is affected by a lot of things, not just exercise, but when we do quantitative research, we're often looking at just one thing, and it tends to be pretty clean. Right, so we're simplifying the world down and trying to study just one component of it, this variable as it affects this variable. So you might have a laboratory study like this study down here that looks at sleep and health. So you have 447 people. People wear devices that measure throughout the day their movement and when they're awake or asleep. And then it looks at the difference between how they sleep during the week and how they sleep on the weekends. So do people tend to, sleep, like 8 hours during the week and then 8 hours on the weekend? So that's like a more regular schedule. Or is there a bigger mismatch? And a mismatch means do you sleep 5 hours a night during the week and then 8 or 9 hours a night on the weekend, and that's a big mismatch. And so the mismatch means that it results in there's an association with worse health. So when we're talking about health, we need to have an operational definition of health, and in this case, health is looked at by metabolic risk, and metabolic risk is measured by different variables like blood cholesterol level. They looked at insulin resistance, BMI. So these kind of factors can be a operational definition of health. And they looked at it controlling for exercise, how much people ate, how much people drank, so that they could look at it specifically connected to sleep. So basically, the larger the gap between how much you sleep during the week and how much you sleep on the weekends, the worse your metabolic risk, the higher your metabolic risk. So when you hear research that says it's better to sleep in a routine, to sleep the same number of hours every day, that statement, like if you read it in the media, comes from this kind of research. And this is quantitative research, numbers-based, and it looks at a small number of variables, limited information, and it comes out with a simple result. And that's an example of quantitative research. So a famous example of qualitative research is something that is called the tea room trade. And this was done by in the 1970s by a researcher named Laud Humphreys. And Humphreys, this research is could never be done now because it would never pass. I'm sorry, it was done in the 60s, and it could never be done now because it would not pass ethics boards. So all research now has to pass ethics to make sure that it's ethically done. And so a lot of research that you'll hear about in different classes that was done in the 50s and 60s and 70s can't be done now because it's just not appropriate. But back then, people just kind of did what they wanted, and he pretty much did what he wanted. And so the word tea room comes from this idea that during this time, the gay men, right, homosexuality was very taboo, very hidden, and very secretive. And gay men would find places to meet for anonymous gay sex. And this still happens. It happens in Richmond. My parents live across from the Virginia Museum, and it used to be that the park across the street from their house was one of the places where men would meet. And they actually ended up getting rid of a lot of the shrubbery and greenery over there to stop that process. And there are still places that this happens, and there are places in New York City I know of, and different places where men can meet. And now they have apps where men can do this to meet for anonymous sex. But now it's not, because it's taboo, and you might get beaten up or killed if you're found doing this kind of sexual activity. Now it's more for, it is taboo to have sex with someone you don't know, in that sense, with a stranger in a strange place. So it's more of the excitement part of it rather than for the fact that, you can't be openly gay anymore. So he was curious about this activity, and so so here's an example of a situation where you have a phenomenon that you're interested in it, and you don't really know anything about it, right? So you don't have a hypothesis you can test, you don't have a theory, you don't know what's going on, right? So you can't do any kind of quantitative research. There's no variables, there's nothing to test. So he started going to these bathrooms and observing, and he was interested in kind of the different roles that people play and kind of what goes on. And he discovered pretty quickly that there was a role of someone who was called a watch queen. And a watch queen is someone who observed the activities of what was going on, but acted as a kind of guard for the public bathroom, so that if someone came to the bathroom, he would make a sound or a noise to notify the people that someone was coming. And so he took on this role in different bathrooms. And so he was able to observe and kind of watch this phenomenon of how this happened. And then he started, he wanted to know, so who are these men? And he couldn't really go up and ask them. And so he started taking out license plate numbers of the men who were coming to the bathrooms. And then he went to the police, and the police basically told him who the men were, and if they had criminal records, and gave him their information. This would never happen now. But back then, you know, these were gay men, and life was a lot different then. So he would go to their houses and present himself as a researcher, but they would not know that he was there as a researcher who had found them because he had seen them in the bathroom. So through this method, he was able to gather data about the people who were engaged in this anonymous behavior. So, and this is all completely unethical. And based on his research, he gathered lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of data. And one of the things he found was that there were different types of men who came to the tea room for this anonymous behavior. And he found, I think, 5 different types. And one of them were heterosexual men who were married, had families, and who would come by like on their way to or from work, and who did not in any way define themselves as gay, but would come for the kind of excitement and contact. Was his assumption of their motivation. He didn't know. He didn't talk to them about their motivation, but based on his observation. But when he went to look at them, they were, married and had kids and did not in any way define as homosexual. So that was one of the types, were these kind of straight defining people. There are lots of straight defining men who have homosexual contact with other men, but still define themselves as straight. So this is one of the types of people that he found. So here's a situation where he went from no data, he went and made observations, and from those observations he saw patterns, and based on the patterns he made hypotheses that there are straight defining men who are living straight lives, who kind of veer off into this taboo behavior as part of their kind of day-to-day lives, looking for excitement. So that's something that then you could take and actually test. But that's how inductive reasoning works. You don't know anything about it. You go out, gather data, and look for patterns. Another example of that was done by John Gottman. And John Gottman studies relationships, and I don't know if he's still actively involved, but there's still the Gottman Institute where professionals can train and couples can go for therapy, counseling, like counseling weekends. And John Gottman studied people arguing. And they had lots of different contexts for doing it, but one of the contexts was that they had like a living room that was set up with cameras. This was before reality television, but it kind of, it's like a Big Brother or whatever you would call a living room that was wired. And they would bring couples in and they would have them talk about things that were difficult in the relationship. And so they're basically watching people argue. And people were kind of shy at first, but pretty quickly, if you introduce a topic that's difficult in a marriage or relationship, people will forget about the fact that they're being observed pretty quickly and go for it. So people would talk about money or other issues that they were having in their relationship. And then he studied couples and observed, and then he would follow up a number of years later with the couples. And he found that it wasn't arguing that led to couples either being divorced or the relationship not being intact in 6 years, which was his time. He used 6 years, or being together in 6 years but being miserable. It wasn't the fact that people argued. It was what they did when they argued. And so there were, he and his graduate students watched the videos of people arguing, and they did, there's a concept called coding. And in coding, you imagine if you're watching a video and there's no sound of two people arguing, and you watch their expressions, and each time they make a certain expression, you make note of it, right? Because facial expressions are pretty easy to categorize. So if someone is happy or angry or sad or curious, or you could, make a note of that expression. And then if you have the audio on, you can also note, the kind of things people are saying, like someone's making a statement that's accusing, or someone's making a statement that's supportive, or so they coded and looked at all the things that happened in arguing. And what they found were 4 things that happened during arguing that basically doomed the relationship to end or be miserable. And these 4 things he called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And these were 4, dance steps in arguing that, condemned a relationship to be miserable. And they are contempt, right? So talking to a person like they're a piece of shit. Criticism, which is where you criticize the person rather than behaviors. So, I really don't like it when you leave the wet towels on the floor. You're a lazy slob. Stonewalling, which is when you shut down and refuse to engage in conversation or discussion. And then defensiveness, and defensiveness is where you never do anything wrong, right? So you never acknowledge your role in anything that's happening in a relationship. So he also looked, if you're interested, you can read more about it. He looked at the ratio. This is separate from what I'm talking about here, but he looked at the ratio of positive to negative interactions, and found that there's kind of a golden ratio of positive to negative interactions. And then he also looked at like reaching out and kind of connection behaviors. And they did this research where they filmed couples, like a bunch of couples, and like kind of like not at a party, but just at an event, and they watched them, and they would watch couples, and people would make like a kind of reaching out for connection. You'd say something to your partner like, "Hey, look at that," and sometimes your partner would be like, oh, that's interesting. And sometimes your partner would be looking at their phone and they'd be like, yeah. And, he found that when people reach out for connection and it's met with connection, the relationship is much more likely to be successful than if they're reaching out for connection and it's not met with connection. And this is also true for kids, that kids do a lot of reaching out, just, little gambits for, hey, I'm here, I see you, and that often parents ignore them or brush them off. And it just creates an environment where kids don't feel seen. And then one of the things kids will do when they don't feel seen is they'll then step it up so that they do get seen. So when I just read a quote on Facebook that was like, oh my God, my child wants to talk about Minecraft, and my daughter loves to tell me stories about Minecraft, and I just want to die. But I try to listen and ask questions and be interested, even though so because I know that's her making a bid for connection and trying to share something with me. So anyway, the other example of qualitative research is the Net-LaRoe, going back to unequal childhoods, which we'll be talking again, the study she did of different parenting styles of the different social classes. So these studies, right, are messy, right, and colorful, right, and interesting. They did, like, qualitative research tends to be a lot more interesting than quantitative research, right? It's a lot more interesting to talk about anonymous homosexual sex in bathrooms than it is to talk about, you know, HDL levels and mismatches in sleep. So they tend to be a lot more interesting and free form, right? And you end up with lots and lots of text that comes from notes, right? And again, you can see Gottman's research is very inductive. So he went in kind of with a blank slate, and he came out at the other end with theory, which is there are these 4 things. And now these 4 things, you could take them and do quantitative research. You could test these 4 things predict the end of a relationship or an unhappy relationship, and you could actually do quantitative research with it. So often what happens with qualitative research is you kind of discover phenomenon that can then be tested. Okay. All right, let's stop there, and I'll do the rest in another video.